Hello, my loves. We are at chapter 43 and 44, the last two chapters of Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. And the last chapter was a tough one, chapter 42, The Bus and the Willow, where Sal finally makes it to Lewiston in time for her mother's birthday. And chapter 43 is called Our Gooseberry, and chapter 44 is called By Banks. Again, I apologize in advance if I get a little emotional, but it's a tough read. Our Gooseberry. Instead of taking me to jail, the sheriff drove me to Coeur d'Alene with the deputy following us in Graham's car. The sheriff gave me a lengthy and severe lecture about driving without a license, and he made me promise that I would not drive again until I was 16. Not even on Gramps' farm, I said. He looked straight ahead at the road. I suppose people are going to do whatever they want to on their own farms, he said, as long as they have a lot of room to maneuver and as long as they are not endangering the lives of any other persons or animals. But I'm not saying you ought to. I'm not giving you permission or anything. I asked him to tell me about the bus accident. When I asked him if he had been there that night and if he had seen anyone brought out of the bus, he said, "You don't want to know all that. A person shouldn't have to think of those things." Did you see my mother? I saw a lot of people, Salamanca, and maybe I saw your mother and maybe I didn't. But I'm sorry to say that if I did see her, I didn't know it. I do remember that, but I wasn't with him when, I wasn't there when. Did you see Mrs. Cadaver? I said. How do you know about Mrs. Cadaver? He said. Of course I saw Mrs. Cadaver. Everyone saw Mrs. Cadaver. 9 hours after that bus rolled over, as all of those stretchers were being carried up the hill and everyone despairing, there was her hand coming up out of the window, and everyone was shouting because there it was, a moving hand. He glanced at me. I wish it had been your mother's hand. Mrs. Cadaver was sitting next to my mother, I said. Oh. They were strangers to each other when they got on that bus, but by the time they got off 6 days later, they were friends. My mother told Mrs. Cadaver all about me and my father and our farm in By Banks. She told Mrs. Cadaver about the fields and the blackberries and Moody Blue and the chickens and the singing tree. I think that if she told Mrs. Cadaver all that, then my mother must have been missing us, don't you think? I'm sure of it, the sheriff said. And how do you know all of this? So I explained to him how Mrs. Cadaver had told me all of this on the day Phoebe's mother returned. Mrs. Cadaver told me about how my father visited her in the hospital in Lewiston after he had buried my mother. He came to see the only survivor from the car crash, and when he learned that Mrs. Cadaver had been sitting next to my mother, they started talking about her. They talked for 6 hours straight. Mrs. Cadaver told me about her and my father writing to each other and about how my father had needed to get away from By Banks for a while. I asked Mrs. Cadaver why my father hadn't told me how he'd met her, and she said he had tried, but I didn't want to hear it, and he didn't want to upset me. He thought I might dislike Margaret because she had survived and my mother had not. Do you love him? I had asked Mrs. Cadaver. Are you going to marry him? Goodness, she said. It's a little early for that. He's holding on to me because I was with your mother and I held her hand in her last moments. Your father isn't ready to love anyone else yet. Your mother was one of a kind. That's true. She was. And even though Mrs. Cadaver had told me all of this and had told me how she had been with my mother in her last minutes, I still did not believe that my mother was actually dead. I still thought that there might have been a mistake. I don't know what I had hoped to find in Lewiston. Maybe I expected I would see her walking through a field and I would call to her and she would say, "Oh, Salamanca, my left arm," and "Oh, Salamanca, take me home." I slept for the last 50 miles into Coeur d'Alene, and when I awoke, I was sitting in the sheriff's car outside of the hospital entrance. He handed me an envelope and slid in beside me on the seat. In the envelope was a note from Gramps, giving the name of the motel that he was staying at. Beneath that, he had written, "I am sorry to say that our gooseberry died at 3 o'clock this morning." Tough one, boys and girls. I was really angry with Sharon Creech when she made Grams die. It's a lot. Gramps was sitting on the side of the bed in the motel talking on the telephone. When he saw me and the sheriff at the door, he put the phone down and he hugged me to him. The sheriff told Gramps how sorry he was and that he didn't think it was the time or place to give anybody a lecture about underage granddaughters driving down a mountainside in the middle of a night. He handed Gramps his car key and asked Gramps if he needed any help making any arrangements. Gramps said that he had taken care of most things. Graham's body was being flown back to Bybanks, where my father would meet the plane. Gramps and I were going to finish what had to be done in Coeur d'Alene and leave the next morning. After the sheriff and his deputy left, I noticed Graham's and Gramps' open suitcase. Inside were Graham's things, all mixed in with Gramps' clothes. I picked up her baby powder and smelled it. On the desk was a crumpled letter. When Gramps saw me look at it, he said, "I wrote her a letter last night. It's a love letter." Gramps lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. "Chickabiddy," he said, "I miss my gooseberry." He put one arm over his eyes. His other hand patted the empty space beside him. "This ain't," he said. "This ain't." "It's okay," I said. I sat down on the other side of the bed and held his hand. "This ain't your marriage bed," I said. About 5 minutes later, Gramps cleared his throat and said, "But it will have to do." That's the end of chapter 43. Here we go. Last chapter, Bybanks. We are back in Bybanks now. My father and I are living on our farm again, and Gramps is living with us. Graham is buried in the aspen grove where she and Gramps were married. We miss our gooseberry every single day. Lately, I've been wondering if there might be something hidden behind the fireplace. Because just as the fireplace was hidden behind the plaster wall, and my mother's story was behind Phoebe's, I think there was a third story behind Phoebe's and my mother's, and that was Graham and Gramps. On the day after Graham was buried, her friend Gloria, the one Graham thought was so much like Phoebe, and the one who had a hankering for Gramps, came to visit Gramps. They sat on our porch while Gramps talked about Graham for 4 hours straight. Gloria asked if we had any aspirin. She had a grand headache. We haven't seen her since. I wrote to Tom Fleet, the boy who helped Graham when the snake took a snack out of her leg. I told him that Graham made it back to Bybanks, but unfortunately, she came in a coffin. I described the aspen grove where she was buried and told him about the river nearby. He wrote back saying that he was sorry about Graham and maybe he would come and visit that aspen grove someday. Then he asked, "Is your riverbank private property?" Gramps is giving me more driving lessons in the pickup truck. We practice over on Gramps' old farm where the new owner lets us clonk around on the dirt roads. With us rides Gramps' new beagle puppy, which he named Huzzah Huzzah. Gramps pets the puppy and smokes his pipe as I drive, and we both play the moccasin game. It's a game we made up on our way back from Idaho. We take turns pretending we are walking in someone else's moccasins. If I were in PB's moccasins, I would be jealous of a brother dropping out of the sky. If I were in Graham's moccasins right minute, I would want to cool my feet in that river over there. If I were walking in Ben's moccasins, I would miss Salamanca Hiddle. On and on we go. We walk in everybody's moccasins, and we have discovered some interesting things that way. One day I realized that our whole trip out to Lewiston had been a gift from Graham and Gramps to me. They were giving me a chance to walk in my mother's moccasins, to see what she had seen and feel what she might have felt on her last trip. I also realized that there were lots of reasons why my father didn't take me to Idaho when he got the news of her death. He was too grief-stricken and he was trying to spare me. Only later did he understand that I had to go and see for myself. He was right about one thing though. We didn't need to bring her body back because she is in the trees, the barn, the fields. Gramps is different. He needs Graham right there. He needs to walk out to that aspen grove to see his gooseberry. One afternoon, after we had been talking about Prometheus stealing fire from the sun to give to man, and about Pandora opening up the forbidden box with all the evils of the world in it, Gramps said that those myths evolved because people needed a way to explain where fire came from and why there was evil in the world. That made me think of Phoebe and the lunatic, and I said, if I were walking in Phoebe's moccasins, I would have to believe in a lunatic and an axe-wielding Mrs. Cadaver to explain my mother's disappearance. Phoebe and her family helped me, I think. They helped me to think about and understand my own mother. Phoebe's tales were like my fishing in the air. For a while, I needed to believe that my mother was not dead and that she would come back. I still fish in the air sometimes. It seems to me that we can't explain all the truly awful things in the world, like war and murder and brain tumors. And we can't fix these things. So we look at these frightening things that are closer to us and we magnify them until they burst open. Inside is something that we can manage, something that isn't as awful as it had first seemed. It is a relief to discover that although there might be axe murderers and kidnappers in the world, most people seem a lot like us, sometimes afraid and sometimes brave, sometimes cruel and sometimes kind. I decided that bravery is looking at Pandora's box full in the eye as best you can and then turning to the other box, the one with the smooth, beautiful folds inside. Mama kissing trees, My Gram saying huzzah, huzzah. Gramps in his marriage bed. My mother's postcards and her hair are still beneath the floorboards in my room. I reread all the postcards when I came home. Gram and Gramps and I had been to every place my mother had. There are the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, the Badlands. The only card that is still hard for me to read is the one from Coeur d'Alene, the one that I received 2 days after she had died. When I drive Gramps around in his truck, I also tell him all the stories my mother told me. His favorite is a Navajo one about Etzana Telehi. She is a woman who never dies. She grows from baby to mother to old woman and then turns into a baby again, and on she goes, living 1,000 lives. Gramps likes this, and so do I. I still climb the sugar maple tree, and I have heard the singing tree sing. The sugar maple tree is my thinking place. Yesterday in the sugar maple, I realized that I was jealous of 3 things. The first jealousy is a foolish one. I am jealous of whoever Ben wrote about in his journal because it was not me. The second jealousy is this. I am jealous that my mother had wanted more children. Wasn't I enough? When I walk in her moccasins, though, I say, if I were my mother, I might want more children, not because I don't love my Salamanca, but because I love her so much. I want more of these. Maybe that is a fish in the air, and maybe it isn't, but it's what I want to believe. The last jealousy is not foolish, nor is it one that will go away just yet. I am still jealous that Phoebe's mother came back and mine did not. I miss my mother. Ben and Phoebe write to me all the time. Ben sent me a Valentine in the middle of October that said, "Roses are red, dirt is brown. Please be my Valentine or I'll frown." There was a P.S. added, "I've never written any poetry before." I sent a Valentine back that said, "Dry as the desert, wet as the rain. Your love for me is not in vain." I added a P.S. that said, "I've never written any poetry either." Ben and Phoebe and Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Partridge are all coming to visit next month. There is a chance that Mr. Berkway might come as well, but Phoebe hopes not, as she does not think that she could stand to be in a car for that long with a teacher. My father and I have been scrubbing the house for their visit. I can't wait to show Phoebe and Ben the swimming hole in the fields, the hayloft and the trees, and the cows and the chickens. Blackberry, the chicken that Ben gave me, is queen of the coop. I'll show her Ben too. I am hoping also for some blackberry kisses. But for now, Gramps has his beagle, and I have a chicken and a singing tree. And that's the way it is. Huzzah, huzzah. The end. Walk Two Moons. Winner of the 1995 Newbery Award. Wonderful book. Amazing stories. So many lessons. So many things that we can all relate to. Sadness. Some funny parts. Just like life, right? And I like the moccasin game of thinking about walking in other people's moccasins, because you really should try to think about what might other people be going through. Remember, everybody has their own agenda, right? You never know the worth of water until the well is dry, but I hope you do know that I hope you do know that. I really do. I hope you know how precious everyone in your life is and how many people there are there that love you, including me, my loves. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Goodbye.